I'm Aidan from Mysteries Ahoy. Join me today as I share 5 reasons that I love the film Memories of Murder. Memories of Murder was the second film by the director Bong Joon, who perhaps is best known now for his film Parasite, but also gave us films like The Host and Okja. A remastered print of this film was recently issued by the Criterion Collection, and it was this that prompted me to want to go ahead and revisit it and talk about it here today. Memories of Murder is a police procedural film in which we follow an investigation into a serial killing that's happened in a rural part of Korea. Now, this film is actually based on a real-life crime that took place between 1986 and 1991. And it was the very first serial killing that took place in Korea. The director carefully researched details of the real crimes, talking to the investigators and people involved in order to help him understand what had happened. And then he took those details and he fictionalized them. It's important to stress, this is not a docudrama. It doesn't use real people's names, and it fictionalizes a number of events and invents some as well. But it is a rumination on these murders. While this is a film that is about the police's attempt to catch a killer, it's actually not about the killer themselves. Instead, this is about the detectives. Song Kang-ho plays Detective Park. He's one of Korea's best-known actors, and he plays the character as someone who relies exclusively on gut instinct. This is a man who believes that he can look someone in the eyes and immediately tell whether or not they're guilty. We soon see, though, that that is far from the case. He's completely out of his depth, and he often ignores real evidence in order to follow those hunches. Kim Sang-hyun plays the second detective, who has come from Seoul, and he has a completely different philosophy. He believes in following the evidence, and he is much calmer, more measured. He often sits back and watches everyone else work, and we see from the start that he treats them with contempt. He doesn't think that they're good detectives. He is following his own leads. He's not really cooperating with their investigation, at least at first. So the director presents us with 2 different viewpoints, which are quite distinct on policing. And across the course of the film, we see them slowly move towards one another as they're changed by the events that happen, as their ideas have been put to the test and fail. And midway through the film, there's a point at which they probably pass each other, and they end up completely the opposite as the way they've started. You could consider that to be growth, though those changes aren't depicted as being for the better. I think this is a really clever idea, and it's portrayed really well by the 2 actors, who give incredibly fine performances, as in fact does everyone in the cast. It's a really good ensemble. All of the film's action takes place against the background of growing social unrest against the military government at the time. We see in the background little clips from student protests and the police repression that happens. There are also lots of other ways that we notice small details that indicate a level of authoritarian control. Now, I think this film is making a couple of points here. One of them is that the investigation is harmed by things that are external, by the state of Korean society at that time. We also see that they don't have access to some materials that they need to do the best job. For instance, there isn't DNA testing available. They have to send the DNA away overseas. But there's another implication towards the end of the film that I think is really fascinating. The final murder takes place during one of the government's blackouts. And there's this idea that in some ways society has contributed and created the circumstances necessary in order for those crimes to occur. I think the film is also really clear that some of the actions of the police end up contributing negatively towards the investigation. There's a very early scene in which the crime scene of the first murder hasn't been secured properly, and a crucial footprint is completely obliterated because no one was watching it carefully enough to prevent a truck from driving over it. Similarly, we see that one of the junior detectives repeatedly uses the most brutal methods to try and extract confessions from the people that they're interviewing. Not only is this ineffective in the moment, it provides bad information, and we see people changing their testimony simply to try and avoid the beatings. We also see that it creates further problems later on, both in the way that other people are willing to interact with them, but also we see that when the police have to go back to some of those people, that the previous experiences have clearly changed their relationship. I think that the idea that there's a link between the crime itself and the society behind it is really fascinating, and it's explored very thoughtfully here. In many points in the film, the impetus to move the investigation forwards, it comes from the people who are forced to be on the periphery. The women. There's a young female detective whose role is basically reduced to fetching drinks for the other officers, but she has a contribution that is really important and definitely steps things forwards enormously. And similarly, there's some testimony from 2 or 3 female characters that is important for changing the way we understand the crime and changing what the police are looking for. I think that this is really important given that this is a series of crimes committed against women, that those voices are heard and represented. And I think that it's done quite effectively here, while acknowledging still the constraints of the historical period. Finally, I want to talk about the film's amazing cinematography. There are 2 main aspects of the cinematography that struck me: the use of color and the use of composition. So let's start with the use of color. The film presents us with a really desaturated color palette. And what that means is that we're seeing blacks, whites, and grays, occasionally shades of green, but there aren't any strong uses of color throughout most of it. So that means that when we do see color, it becomes all the more striking, and it stands out to us as a result. Now, I think this is an effective technique for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it means that you do pay more attention when you do see that color. For another, I think it reflects that something of the time, but also the idea that this is a hazy memory. I also think it's really interesting that later in the film, when there's a couple of scenes set in the present day, suddenly the screen becomes brighter, helping once again to differentiate time, but also indicating that things have improved, that they are better than they were. In terms of the composition, there are a number of scenes in the film that are really striking, where the director uses elements in the foreground and the background simultaneously to create tension and to illustrate things. This tends to happen in sequences involving the killer. The killer is never shown directly, they're always shown in silhouette, and the director was very careful to make sure that every scene featured a different actor playing the killer. So you can't see some aspect of the actor and know for sure that they were the guilty party, because this film isn't about that. It's not about certainties, it's about that sense of uncertainty. So there are a number of sequences in which you see them lurking in the background, in the shadows. There's a scene, for instance, in which they're shown up in the leaves of the tree, and you see just a black outline, and you watch that outline move backwards and forwards as they're making a really horrific decision. I think the most striking use of this, though, comes in a sequence in which a character is being pursued without their knowledge. There's a moment where they stop, they hear something, they hear whistling, and once again, the use of sound is equally impressive. They turn and they look around, and the foreground elements are in focus, but in the background you see a very slight movement, a raising and a lowering. And we know that there's someone out there, even if the character being pursued isn't entirely sure. I think it's a really chilling and effective moment that helps build that sense of tension. So, those are just 5 of the reasons that I strongly recommend Memories of Murder. If you've already seen the film, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to share them either here on the video on YouTube or on my blog, Mysteries Ahoy. And I will look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining me.